Thank you. It really is an honor to be here. I was able to visit this church a few years ago, and now here I am standing up in front of you all. But I bring you greetings from the saints at Trinity Reformed Church in Moscow, Idaho. And so, greetings to you. And, this is a delightful time. So, I hope that you brought Bibles with you. If you were my students, I would have you hold it up and repeat after me. I am a Bible bringer. I have pleased Dr. Schlecht. And then I would make everyone else who didn't hold their Bible up say, I am not a Bible bringer. Anyway, but Proverbs chapter 6 is where I want to begin to kind of offer some opening reflections here. Proverbs 6, in a passage that I trust is familiar to many of you. Proverbs 6, beginning at verse 6. Go to the ant, O sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. She prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. This is a positive vision cast now for diligence in general, but I would like you to think about its application for parenting. I might say, go to the ant, O parent. The ant's a model of constant work, of steady work. The ant works for the long game. Look at verse 8. She prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. Now, of course, ants, if you take an entomology class, you'll probably learn that ants don't actually prepare bread. The ant does not collect food by harvesting. Obviously, an ant is a metaphor. The ant's a stand-in to relate to us something that's true about people. But what's the truth that the ant is telling us here? The lesson of the ant is this, that diligence today reaps rewards tomorrow. Diligence today reaps rewards tomorrow. The ant is a model of hard work and delayed reward. Labor now, blessing later. It's a familiar principle that applies to all kinds of pursuits, and it certainly applies to parenting. Go back to the text in verse 8. She prepares her bread in the summer and gathers her food in harvest. Because the ant was diligent in the summer, she gathers her food in harvest. So what is the parent's harvest? Parent's harvest is adult children. Adult children who are industrious, who deploy their talents to act fruitfully in the marketplace and they serve others. Adult children who faithfully contribute to the life of the church. Adult children who establish households of their own, who are devoted to their spouses, who raise children, their own children, to be fruitful. Adult children who rest on Christ for their salvation. This is the parent's harvest. If the harvest metaphor presents the optimistic outlook for the diligent, the text also lays out a warning for the not so diligent. And this is where we could pick up at verse 9. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber and want like an armed man. Now, bear with me here. I'd like to take another crack at verses 9 through 11 that I just read, but this time with some liberties. How long will you lie there, O inattentive parent? When will you rise from your inattention? A little parental inattention, a little parental neglect, a little putting off of your parenting and leaving it for another day, and your children will emerge as ill-prepared, ill-equipped adults, and perhaps even unfaithful adults. And they will come upon your household like a robber. It might seem outlandish to apply to parenting, but I think it's warranted. I think it's warranted even in this passage, and I invite you to fast forward down, still in Proverbs chapter 6, but down to verses 20 and following. Notice how the text itself highlights the relationship between parent and child. Proverbs 6:20 now. My son, keep your father's commandment. Forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always. Tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will talk with you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light, and the proofs of discipline are the way of life. Notice back up in verse 20, it addresses a father's commandment and a mother's teaching. What is so important about a father's commandment and a mother's teaching? The instruction that mom and dad provide when the little ones are, little, is instruction that guides them when they're adults. These verses connect the parenting you do today with what happens later on in your child's life. Parents are responsible for the first few chapters of what is actually a much larger story, the story of your child's life. And you need to parent with this realization in view. I would suggest a lot of parenting failures arise from treating the season of time, that season when your children are under your roof, as a whole story complete unto itself. This is a sort of dispensational approach to parenting, if I may. When your child, as though your child's childhood inhabits a different dispensation from their adulthood, their childhood, it is a separate and distinct existence, a season of life that operates according to a different set of natural laws, a different set of covenant obligations than adulthood. Don't view your kid's future adulthood as though it is somehow disconnected from the present, from their childhood in the present. Think of your kid's life as a chapter in a long book. And these first few chapters, when the kids are under your roof, the under your roof chapters, are setting the stage for the later chapters in your kid's life. And it's the same story. There's continuity between the early chapters and the later chapters. That's what Proverbs 6 is suggesting here. And of course, you have a lot of editorial control over the early chapters of this story and very little editorial control later on. You are setting up the story of your child's life. That's either a good story, a happy story. It could be a troubled story. It could be a tragedy. But you are setting up this story. It's just where you are. I'm not saying you should be setting your kids up. No, realize that you are setting your kids up. That's the way it is. And so, with that opening reflection, I want to talk about the manner of my approach both tonight and tomorrow broadly. Tonight, I'm actually going to talk about older kids. And if you have older kids, I hope you'll find my remarks helpful. But if you have younger kids, preschool age kids, I'm excited to hear that there are parents yet to be, people who are much younger and not even perhaps married yet. I'm excited that you all are here. I think that even the older kid stuff is going to be applicable to you. In fact, no less applicable to you. The best way to think about parenting is to start with the end. To start with the end in view. Start by imagining kids as adults and then work your way backward. Think about the day when they move out. And of course, they've got an adulthood beyond the move-out day, let's hope. But just to drop into this moment in time, on that day, when they move out, on that day you'll want them ready to hold down a job. Have you set them on a trajectory for that? And not just any job, but a career job. Are they ready to choose a spouse? Are they ready to set up a household as husband or wife? Ready to be parents themselves on that day when they move out. That's the move out day. Now then walk backward from there. If your kids are 16 or 13 or preschool, or if you're pregnant or looking ahead to that day, you should ask yourself, how will I prepare them for move out day? How will I prepare them for move out day? And tonight, I'm going to be talking about parenting the older kids closer to move out day. And tomorrow, I'm going to push back earlier, starting with that end and then push back earlier and talk about parenting younger kids. But I hope that by talking about working with older kids, it actually makes a whole lot more sense of what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. I actually think this is the foundational time, foundational for thinking about younger kids. All right. So my first point that I want to move into then, what actually is my central point for tonight and extending into tomorrow, which is that you need to parent in faith. And it ties in with what I was saying with the ant. And of course, that sounds like a happy platitude. Anyone going to disagree as Christians, disagree with the proposition that we should parent in faith? It's an easy audience for me to say this in front of. But faith is essentially a peculiar way of looking at the future, a peculiar outlook on the future. Your thinking about the future should be dictated more by the promises of God and less by what you see in front of you. A faithful outlook on the future should be disciplined and enraptured by the promises of God. That should be what guides your posture toward the future, your attitude toward the future, your reflections upon the future, more than what you see in front of you. Faith is defined in Hebrews 11:1, a familiar passage. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. When you look at your teenager, if you have a 16-year-old, you kind of see that they aren't ready for that move-out day, maybe. The kid does stupid things. Is this kid ready for real responsibilities? Does he really understand a lot about the real world? How about the 13-year-old? He doesn't possess marketable skills, at least not enough to support a household, makes bad judgments. Your kid is not ready to lead a business. He's not ready to be ordained as an elder or deacon at age 10. Not ready to take on the responsibility of marriage and child rearing at age 8. Don't let these observations of your child dictate how you think about your child's future. Don't let these observations distract you from the promises of God for your child. Take your cues about your kid's future from the promises of God and not from your teenager's behavior, capacity, actions, or whatever. That, I suggest, is parenting in faith. That's what it means. We're in Proverbs here. Turn ahead to chapter 22. Proverbs 22 now. Again, a familiar passage for a parenting seminar. Proverbs 22:6. I know many of you probably know this. Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. But I would invite you to look at the context. This is one of those passages that oftentimes gets parachuted in out of nowhere. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. But look, rewind back up to verse 3. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. The reward for humility and fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life. Notice the future orientation. In verse 3, the prudent are those, excuse me, the prudent, of course, are those who look ahead. The prudent see into the future. Here they're anticipating danger, looking ahead to see danger, and so they act now. And so they act now in order to prevent that future danger. In verse 4, they hold out for future reward. They see reward in the future, and so they act now. Turning to verse 5, thorns and snares are in the way of the crooked. Whoever guards his soul will keep far from them. Here again, a reflection on the future, about the way ahead. When you consider the future, you look out for thorns and snares and you anticipate them. The text speaks of guarding his soul. The very notion of guarding is anticipatory. It's future-oriented, it's future-looking. And now verse 6 comes on the heels of all of that. And so train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Again, this is one of those verses that's become cliche. But the thing about cliches is they're true. This is not a novel verse, and so they become truths. One of the challenges with cliches is that they're dropped in there and then we don't meditate on them because they're maybe too familiar. This passage does not tell parents to train up a child according to how the child is. Notice this is conspicuously not what it says. Train up a child in the way he is, and then when he's old, he will turn out whatever is going to make of that. It's train up a child in the way he should be, in the way he's going to be, and the script of what he's going to be is written in the promises of God for your child. The script is not in what you see in front of you. This underscores my main point to parent in faith. Parenting in faith means treating your children better than they deserve to be treated. Regard them as if they have achieved more than what they have actually achieved. In fact, this is how the Lord treats us. Parenting in faith affects many things, and I want to highlight a couple of practical areas now, but I want you to think about that as a foundation for parenting in faith. I want to highlight the area of how you talk to your kids, and then how you hand over responsibility to your kids, part of training them up in the way they should go, anticipating the adults that they will become. So first, how do you talk to your kids in a way that is parenting in faith? There's a future orientation in how you should interact verbally to have exchanges with your kid. You should keep their future before them, and you should keep it before them in a hopeful way. If you were to ask your kids, what do your parents think of you? Would they say, my parents are disappointed in me regularly. I often disappoint them. Would your kids say that they regularly come up short of your expectations, that parents don't trust them? Here's maybe a more probing question. Is your delight in your kids contingent upon the works that your kids perform? Does your approach to parenting catechize your kids into justification by works? Or are they assured that you're in their corner, that you are with them, that you are pleased with them, that you are confident in their future, even when they're fearful of their own future? Your confidence outpaces theirs. When you gauge the future that lies in store for your kids, again, do you rest more upon God's promises as a gauge for their future, or do you look to their performance as the gauge for their future? Do you show your kids that this is how you see them? You should paint a brighter future for your kids than they can paint for themselves. And this is where faith comes in. And you need to speak words of faith to them. You need to speak the promises of God to them, but you need to speak to the promises of God to them, which means to put them into the narrative of God's promises. And so it needs to get granular, highly pixelated, detailed in their circumstances as you teach and interact with them. So I would hope that, and think about this, as you look to your son, would your son think, Dad thinks I have a great career ahead of me? Dad's nuts. But Dad thinks I have a great career ahead of me, the 6-year-old thinks. The 8-year-old, the 14-year-old thinks. Dad thinks that I'm going to be a great dad. And he talks about being a grandpa. That's, To my kids, and I'm 10, that's a great thing for a 10, and that should be sort of shocking for a 10-year-old, eyes like saucers for a 10-year-old. Well, that's the vision that you want to cast for your kids, and it's your vision that you're imparting to them because it's the vision that the new covenant gives that you're casting and preaching to them. That you believe your daughters are on their way to becoming great moms. That in your view, your sons and your daughters they're on a trajectory to be leaders in the church, to serve other people. They're going to have gifts that are going to bless many people in the church, and you look forward to seeing that day. Should the Lord bless that you can see that day, and you should talk about that to your 12-year-old. I learned as a coach. I coached mock trial. It was a pretty successful mock trial team. We went to the national tournament, beat the California champion a couple of times, got beaten by the California champion other times, but I have to mention that when I travel to other states. I bet we beat your state champion. So it's sort of oratory, debate kind of combined, and the kids would stand in front of, they would be in real courthouses, real courtrooms, judges. I remember when my son was on the team, he had to speak and argued in front of the Chief Justice of New Mexico with photographers around him. But in that experience of coaching, one of the interesting things was, the uniform was a suit, okay? And it's really interesting what happens when you put a suit onto a high school freshman. When you put a suit onto a high school freshman, there's this awkwardness that lasts just a little bit, but the kids act up to the suit. The kids wind up acting up to the suit. Well, that's how you should talk to your speech to your children should be like that suit that they're going to grow into, that they're going to act up to one day. If your little girls play dress up and they try to balance in the heels, and it's kind of hilarious, and the heels stick out 3 inches past their heels, the heels of the shoes, that sort of thing. Your speech to them is like dress up, except that you're not just playing around. That's the difference. It really does bring them into the reality, place them into a narrative. So they should hear you say things like, well, when it comes time for you to buy a car, what kind of car you want? How are you going to do that? How are you going to get that? What do you think you're going to look out for when you're buying a car? That you say to your 10-year-old. What kind of house do you think you're going to buy one day? Son, before you know it, daughter, before you know it, you're going to be a great parent. You're going to be a great mom. In fact, I bet you'll be a better mom. Mothers would say this. You'd be a better mom than I am, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. Your speech should be laced with that so that your kids are convinced that you are nuts. Your kids are convinced that you're nuts because your kids are probably looking at themselves and their capacities. Don't join them in that. Lead them to the promises of God and what God has for them. That's what they need to be led out of and away from. Your job as parents is to take the lead in expressing confidence in your kids. You need to express that confidence in their presence. You need to say it directly to their kids, and you need to say it around them. Talk as though their future success should be the most normal thing in the world. Talk about their future success in the workplace, in the family, in the church, in the community. And now, of course, I'm not saying that you should be overconfident. I'm not saying that you should be arrogant. So what's the difference between arrogant talk and faithful talk? Between parenting confides, confidence, with faith on the one hand, and presumption on the other. Arrogance arises when you place your trust in the work of your kid. Arrogance arises when you place your trust in your own work of parenting for those outcomes. But a proper faith is when you place your faith in the work of Christ on behalf of your kids and what Christ is doing in your parenting for them. This is the corrective to arrogance. This is the corrective to arrogance. Our Heavenly Father looks at you and He sees the perfections of His Son, Jesus Christ. Sunday after Sunday, you come into this hall, you worship, and the pastor proclaims upon you an assurance of pardon, of forgiveness. You're welcomed to the table. You're welcome to the table. Our Heavenly Father actually looks at you and sees the perfections of His Son. He sees the perfections of His Son. So come to this table. That's how He sees you. Earthly fathers should look at their sons and daughters and see the perfections of Jesus Christ. And so earthly fathers need to talk that way, around them, to one another as husband and wife when you get discouraged. When your kid does something right, acknowledge it and connect it to something that matters about their future, and acknowledge that Christ is doing a work in them. That was great stuff, son. Keep it up. One day, son, I'll be looking to you for when I apply for my next job. Frame their activities within a narrative. That's just what's going on with the ant in Proverbs chapter 6. Everything they do, frame it in a narrative. Frame it in a narrative. And a narrative means that you've got many chapters ahead yet to be written, but these chapters are always foreshadowing. You're always having spoiler alerts as faithful parents, because God has told us that we have spoiler alerts. That was a hard assignment at school, and you handled it well. You know what? I can just imagine that day when you're at a job and you have this task with an absurd deadline and an unreasonable boss. How you handled that school assignment, that's just setting you up. And you're not going to be that kind of boss, right? All right. Suppose your daughter's working in a restaurant. Some guy asks her out, and she holds her ground, brushes him off, comes back home and tells you the story. You're going to say, oh, that is just so great. You know what? One of these days, you say to your 16-year-old daughter, 17-year-old daughter who brushed off some guy, one of these days, you're going to have a lippy teenager when you're a mom, and you're going to know how to handle it. And I know that from how you handled this moment at work, right? Because you're going to be a mom one day. That's really going to be a useful trait, and I already see it in you. That's just great. Parenting in faith, again, means speaking in a way that connects your kids to the future. Okay, it affects how you talk. It affects the narrative that you color your counsel and interaction with. So that's how you talk with and around your kids. But it also, in the second place, parenting in faith affects how you hand over responsibility to your kids. And you need to hand over responsibility to your kids. Your kids are going to leave the house. Do they know how to do laundry? Okay, so when's that going to happen? When are they going to learn that? Are they prepared? Are they prepared? Probably before age 10, they should be involved in the laundry. I mean, that's probably when they start handling the machinery. Then there's been laundry tasks well before then. I remember my wife, we had 5 kids, and they were 8 years apart between oldest and youngest, so they were all fairly close. And so Brenda, when she would go shopping, she had quite the little entourage around the cart at the grocery store. And it's interesting, Brenda would always shop on Saturday morning. What's fascinating is that all 3 of our adult daughters, who are moms, all 3 of them still shop on Saturday morning because of Brenda. But anyway, she would go there, shop on Saturday morning, the big entourage, and with the older ones, they'd start venturing away. Okay, you're going to go get this, and you're going to go get that. And then they'd spring free from the shopping cart and go to the next aisle. There might be some Schleck kids in opposite ends of the store and then reconnoitering with the shopping cart as the home base because there's some responsibilities being handed to them. As our kids got a little older, I remember this. It was summertime, more flex time in the schedule, and so we had a regime where that some of our kids had already moved out, but our older kids, our son and daughter and I would take a night of the week to prepare the meal. This was all Brenda's doing, all Brenda's concocting. So like my son Bennett would have Wednesday night, and so the whole family, okay, don't blow it, Bennett. Like he's got Wednesday. And then whatever Bennett prepares on Wednesday night, that's the family meal. And then whatever Lizzie prepares on Thursday night, that's the family meal. And Brenda shops when? Saturday morning. They had to have the ingredient list into Brenda on Saturday morning for that Wednesday or Thursday meal that they had to prepare. Otherwise, now they've got to fend for it. All right. So hand over responsibility for them, understanding that they have a future, and before they're ready for it, just a little bit before they're ready for it, so that they can grow up into it. I remember taking my boys, I did this with both of my sons, took them in to see a financial advisor when they were in late high school, early college. As soon as they got jobs that started paying fairly decently, they weren't getting rich or anything like that, but they had some income, and so I took them in to see a financial advisor. There was a great Christian financial advisor, kind of sat them down and got laid out their categories and helped them to think about this. And they're learning, you know what, I have to get advice from some people for stuff. Dad, I'm not the best financial advisor. I have to outsource that to people who know what's going on. But the principle is this: you want your kids to cross that threshold into adulthood, and when they cross that threshold, it should not be abrupt. It should not be an abrupt crossing. It should be just something that's, it should almost be like, oh, did that happen? As you, as your kids near that threshold, as they're near that threshold, what it means to be an engaged parent changes. Now, and think about this, as your kids are approaching teenage, you're going to be an engaged parent in the teenage years like you were an engaged parent prior to the teenage years. But the script is going to change. The choreography of your engagement starts to change. In fact, you're never going to be done parenting. You're never going to be done parenting I'm in my mid-50s. My parents are just entering their 90s. I'm blessed that my parents are both still alive, and I still need my parents. But of course, the dynamics are different. The dynamics are different. It looks different. So you're always going to retain that parent-child relationship, but the nature of the relationship is changing. And the essence of the change as your kids get older, but before they leave the home, is this, that someone has to be responsible for them. That responsibility shifts more and more away from you and to the kids themselves. And that responsibility needs to shift while they're under your roof still. Don't let it shift so that they have the abrupt change later. This means a transition for you in your parenting role from being your kid's caretaker to being your kid's counselor or guide. You need to counsel and guide your kid who is more and more and increasingly taking care of himself, taking care of herself. Again, not a dramatic shift, because you're looking ahead even when they're little. So you add on more and more responsibility over time. Start moving them out from home to face the world. So again, once your kid reaches 7th grade, your kid should be managing his or her own deadlines. If there's confusion over the instructions about a school assignment, if your kids are in day school, and I know a number of you have your kids at different schools here, by the time your kids are getting into high school, parents should never step in and ask on behalf of the kid. The student should ask the teacher, not you, not the parent. Suppose you're going out of town, and so your kid's going to miss class on Friday. Suppose your kid has to be at a doctor's appointment on Tuesday. Whatever the case may be, have your child be the one who informs the school. Now, it could be that you need a parent permission slip or something like that, and there's some paperwork to do. I understand you can take care of that, but when's your kid going to do that? It should happen before they leave, and so get out of their way. I'm at New St. Andrews College. I have deadlines imposed upon me. I hear from the dean, I hear from the provost and other colleagues. They hand down instructions to me. When the dean gives me an instruction in my workplace, does the dean copy Joan Schlecht? Why not? Why not? Joan Schlecht is my mother. Well, your kids, before they leave home, they need to be managing these things. What have you given them to manage? Now, before your kids leave home, you want your kids dealing with adults directly rather than through your mediation. What if your kid's teacher is being unreasonable? What if your kid's coach or dance instructor is being unreasonable? Or maybe your kid is waiting tables at a restaurant, flipping burgers at In-N-Out or whatever it is you do here in California. What a great opportunity to coach your kid through the process of dealing with an unreasonable adult. Make them deal with adults. And you're going to talk it up with, okay, so here's what you're going to, now what's the issue? Okay, so here's some points to make. And then they go out and then comes back, how did it go? Well, it did this, that, this. We'll coach them through it rather than intervening and dealing with it for them. Dealing with it for them. The adult interaction that your kids have with you, more and more should be you in the coach role rather than you as the one they're dealing with. Right? They should be interacting a lot with you as they're dealing with the world, as they're dealing with things out there, and you should give them things to deal with. And of course, they're coming back home, and then we're talking about it. You're coaching them up ahead of time. That's the relationship that you want to cultivate with your kids. Many of you have your kids enrolled in school, of course, not because, like Trinity Classical, not because it's a perfect place. That's not why you enrolled your kids there. What a horrible reason to enroll your kids in a school. It's a perfect place. The richest parenting moments that Brenda and I had involved adults who weren't quite getting it right unto our kids, whether that, and that happened with coaches, that happened with teachers, that happened with bosses, all of those categories. And they were some of the sweetest times as parents around the dinner table, in the car, as we're talking about things, and you send them out, they're taking responsibility, and then you're guiding, watching them, and that responsibility gradually increases and the conversations grow more and more rich because they're dealing with the world and interacting with you. They're not dealing with you. Okay? You're not the thing that they have to deal with. The thing that they have to deal with is out there. I remember one of our daughters wound up working at the front desk at a hotel, and so she dealt with the customer complaints. And the stories she brought home, it was so great. She really got good at it. I think people need to get coaching from her, including us. There were times when complaining customers came to her, and then they left having been upsold several services, thanks to my daughter. But again, when they're in high school, they should be keeping track of assignments, deadlines. An anxious parent is going to say, well, if I leave it in their hands, the deadline might get missed. That's why your kids have deadlines, so that they can learn what happens when deadlines get missed. Don't try to intervene and remove the consequence. I remember when our girls, this was a challenge, but high school senior age, and a plan was hatched with girlfriends to go out of town overnight in a car that they were taking. And they were high school seniors, and I thought of, that was tough, like, our little girls, and those friends. And they were good friends. They were good friends that they were going with. And Brenda and I prayed a lot. I thought of the consequences of saying yes, what could go wrong. But I also thought of the consequences of saying no. And the only reason to say no was, I'm scared, I don't trust you as a parent, that's kind of scary, and not prepare my daughter for the real world. I mean, this is a year after, she wound up being married just a couple of years after this. So when your kids are reaching that age, they should go on these sorties outside the house, and then you parent them. When I remember talking with my son he was around 15 years old, and I talked to him about when he would hang out with his friends. I said, okay, so you always need to check with us about what like if you're going to watch a movie, go over to a friend's house and you're going to stream some movie, we want to know what the movie is. When he reached age 16, I said, hey, I'm letting you know, you don't need to tell us what the movie is now. You need to investigate it for yourself. The thing is, you need to tell me how it goes. But it's your call whether it's an appropriate movie to watch. So the deal is, you're going to make the call, and you're going to tell me how it went. We're going to debrief after this one way or another. I get to decide whether this is a good movie or not, an appropriate movie or not. They should be making those decisions before they leave house. The long-term goal in terms of your relationship is that think about how you want your kids relating to you when they're 30, when they're 40, and you're 20 years beyond that, 20, 30 years older than they are. My son, a couple years ago, he was 22, already married, and had a career track job as a mechanical engineer, and had a job offer to go somewhere else as a mechanical engineer. And he struggled with that. And so my son, who is a dad with a couple of kids and his wife, comes to me and says, "What do you think about this?" He had a big decision to make about a major job change, and he sought my input, which is a real blessing. My kids continue to seek my input as they're grown up. One of my sons now is an elder at a CREC church. And we've had a wonderful coffee talking shop about church leadership, father and son. Well, what are you doing when the kids are younger to make it so that the coaching relationship is what continues on into life? That relationship should be established before they leave home, and you have a modus operandi. So the kids are taking on the world, and then they talk to mom and dad, and the law of their mother and the counsel of their father is wise. And I need the counsel of my father, and that's a great blessing. So the point of all this is to parent with the end in view. Parent with the end in view. That's parenting in faith. And it shapes the way you talk around your kids, and it shapes the way you hand over responsibility to your kids. So think about both of those. Thank you very much.
Why don't we take just a
couple quick ones?
Have some questions, come on up. There's a microphone on either side, and then we'll dismiss for a break.
You're talking about parenting positively and in faith. I'm thinking of what about situations when there really is like a sin issue to address? How do
Right.
you not pretend that's not the case, but also be speaking positively into the future while addressing sins as they're coming up?
Yeah, with sins, I would say the choreography for that will shift when you're dealing with little ones. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about spanking. I'm going to talk about liturgies of discipline. That as your kids get older, first of all, they need to face the consequences. You need to be honest and truthful. Like, that was sin. And then you coach them through, what does a Christian do when they fall into sin? And you're in that same role of counseling them through. What is a Christian's attitude when they, you need to make it right, you need to make restitution, you need to seek forgiveness to whoever, and you're coaching them along. And then you're going to also remind them of, that doesn't define you. That doesn't, and of course, that's not who you are. You're in Christ, right? And so, and sometimes as parents, that means the consequence for you. If I don't think he would be too embarrassed for me to say this, the mechanical engineer son, yeah, he's also the son with a motorcycle and with a car, and he ran his car off the road because he was driving a little too carelessly. And so his car privileges got revoked. So there's consequences, yet there was fellowship restored. So you don't want a dark cloud over his head. It's like, okay, so your car privileges are revoked. He was on the varsity basketball team at the time with practices before school. And so mom drops him off, or I drop him off before school. But not a dark cloud. We're for him. Okay, this is a consequence, and we're working with you together as the consequence. So that's the demeanor and the tone, rather than look at what you did, think about what you did. Think, with older kids, I don't think that's a good posture. So, good. And I think we have time for one more. We'll have more questions after the second session, too.
Constructive criticism for that task, or does that kind of
Yeah, that's a really good question, because yes, there is constructive criticism, um, and yes, you can deflate them. I think that's a good caution. Which there's not a formula for this, but this is a human being, and I'm glad you raised the question. I think by raising the question, I think you've pointed to the issue. You need to know your kids, and your kids have to think that you're crazy. Coming back to that, you need to, what I talk about, talking about their future in hopeful ways for the sake of Christ, and the fact that you are with them needs to so color it that when you criticize, and you should have criticism for them, naturally, they need it. But you need to have a lot of deposits in the bank in order to make those withdrawals. And so think about it in terms of that way, and it does become kind of toxic when parents have no money in the bank, and yet they continue to write overdrawn checks, and their kids are deflated as a result. So yeah, it's an important caution. So, all right, very good.
Alrighty, why don't we stand together and pray and talk about all that we've thought about and heard tonight. Father, we thank you again for this time. We pray that you bless us now as we go out and share fellowship and eat and drink, and we pray that we would honor you, and that we would be able to build one another up, continue to make us more and more into the image of our Lord Jesus Christ as we consider these things. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, see you in a few minutes, 20, 30 minutes. I'm also being told, sorry, my wife told me, please, if you have children in childcare, please go get them during this break time, at least for part of it, and help them to go get some food so they can have some time. There's a table just for kids. There's a kids table.
Again, so good to see you. I'll remind you that we're thinking about parenting and starting from the end, and tomorrow the dealing with the littler ones is what's coming. But I want to address at least one more facet of parenting older kids. Preparing them to face the world. And to start into this, I want you to think about the relationship between your children and the world. What is that relationship? On the one hand, the Bible says that your children are not of the world, and that God has chosen them out of the world. That's John 15:19. Your children are not of the world. But on the other hand, the Bible tells you that your children are heirs of the world through faith. Romans 4. So what is a faithful parent's duty in regard to your children in the world? How do you call your children out of the world? I mean, do you call your children out of the world? The answer is yes. Do you send your children into the world? The answer is yes. How do we hold these things together? Do the answers to these questions change as your kids move through various stages of growing up? I think they do. If you have teenagers, I want you to think about this. Within 5 years, your child will reach an age where they're old enough to vote in elections, take up arms and fight in a war, sit on a jury, borrow money from a financial institution, obtain a marriage license on their own, enter into a legally binding contract all on their own. According to the state where I come from, they can give their consent to sexual activity with anybody they want to within 5 years of now. The only thing that qualified my kids to attain this status is the inevitable and irreversible advancement of time. That's the only qualification they have for this. If your child is 10 years old, you are closer in time to the day when they move out than to the day they were born. As Brenda and I look at our own kids today, I can tell you they really are sources of delight. We're so pleased with them. And as our kids have gotten older, I can tell you, Brenda and I sense more and more that gulf between, on the one hand, how great our kids are, and on the other hand, our ability to take any credit for that. They should be messed up. We are becoming more and more pleased with our kids, and yet more and more unsettled about how we parented them, and it's just amazing that they're not messed up. The grace of God is really, really the key to parenting. Over time, that sense of mystery about parenting has only increased. And the more secure in God's promises and less secure in our own parenting we are. Brenda and I continue to pray daily for our children that God will persevere in them in the faith that He has begun in them. Parenting, of course, is not a matter of inserting tab A into slot B, connecting the dots. It's much more mysterious than that. And so that's why I began with a summary about the relationship between your kids and the world. So this evening now, I want to begin with a summons. I want to summon you as parents to send your kids into the world while calling them out of it. Do both. And I want to examine the practicalities of what this might look like. Give your kids exposure to the world, provide them with experience in the world, but do it so that they are salt and light in the world rather than being salted and darkened by it. So here's a remarkable verse about parenting. I bet you've heard this verse before. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. The great parent, the Almighty Father, the one whom you and I worship, didn't just carve out a little niche or alcove for his Son to inhabit. He sent his Son into all habitations everywhere. What kind of parent would do that? And the world that the Father sent his Son into was a perishing world. It was a place fit for condemnation. The world he sent his Son into was not a pretty place. In fact, it was a world filled with pain and death. Notice that the presence of sin and pain and death in the world is a reason for sending the Son. Too many parents today look at sin in the world, they look at the pain, they look at the adversity, the difficulty, and their reaction is to think, not with my kid, you don't. I don't want my kid subjected to that. That's unsafe. Well, the world's not a safe place. Yet the model parent sent his Son into this unsafe place. Now, of course, parents should protect their children, but parents should moderate that protection. You protect your kids only insofar as that protection is consistent with preparing them for a dangerous world. I'll say it again. You protect your kids only insofar as that protection is consistent with preparing them for a world that is dangerous. Again, too many parents pray that their kids will be safe. I pray that my child will be safe. Do you pray that your children will be faithful? And which of those is more important to you? That your kids are safe or that they are faithful? If you truly understand how our Heavenly Father is a pattern for fatherhood, then you should be sending your kids into the world, and your purpose is to transform the world. And of course, your children are members of the body of Christ. Your children, your son, your daughter, are the body of God's Son, the body of that Son whom he sent into the world. Parents, you need to see Jesus in your children. Your children are members of Christ. In your parenting, be imitators of the Heavenly Father who sent Jesus into the world. Send your children to save the world. And I don't mean a precious moments Jesus, the real living Jesus. The Son that this Father sent into the world, how you should send your children into the world. This was a Son who overturns the tables of the money changers. He sent them to feed the 5,000, even though they had meager resources to work with. Send your children to the woman at the well, and send them to tell this woman that the man she's with is not her husband. Send them to that same woman to give her living water. Send your children to weep when they hear the awful news that Lazarus is dead. And send your children to speak words that overcome the sting of death, words that summon forth life. Again, send your children to weep over Jerusalem, and then send them to enter that city and proclaim that its leaders are whitewashed tombs and a brood of vipers. Send your children to lay down their lives for that city, and then pray that the Father would forgive those who killed them. That is how you need to see your relationship between your kids and the world. This means as you send your kids into the world, you must also call them out of the world. In sending them in, they won't be conformed to the world, but that the world would be changed. That's parenting according to John 3:16 and 17. So that's the summons that I'd like to begin with you. And I've got some history notes that I want to offer. And at this point, this is a reading assignment that one of my students has to have read. My student's Mr. Fudge. But this is from Vergerio about, I think, the attribute of fortitude here that he's talking about. He says, he's talking about a contempt for toil. I love that. Listen to this. This man's contempt for toil gives birth to contempt for death as well, and increases his audacity. So intrepidly does he approach every difficulty that one must believe he fears nothing, except perhaps the possibility that he might die an old man. This seems to me an excellent attitude. We should always look to virtue and turn our mind upon famous deeds. We should not care over much for life. Goes on. We ought not to fear that we have perchance lived too little, but rather that we have lived too little the life we have lived. I'll say that again. We ought not to fear that which we have perchance lived too little, but rather that we have lived too little the life we have lived. So that's the summons, to train up your kids to be like that. And I want to turn to some of the practicalities about what this looks like and about the dangers of the world, about worlds that are filled with Taylor Swifts and Travis Kelce's. And I'll organize my practical points under two basic headings, and they're this: to give your kids a healthy exposure to the world and then provide them with experience in it. Give them an exposure and to provide them with experience. And it's a certain kind of exposure, a healthy exposure. And so turn with me, if you will, to Proverbs chapter 7. We were in Proverbs 6 earlier, now Proverbs 7. And I'm going to pick up at verse 7, Proverbs 7:7. And as we look here, pay attention not only to what is taught in this passage, but how it is taught. Fascinating passage on parenting here, Proverbs 7:7. My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commands and live, and my law as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on a tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your nearest kin, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words. Notice that this passage is launching into a story about two women. One of them is in verse 4. In verse 4, wisdom is a woman. And set over against wisdom is the other woman in verse 5, the immoral woman. All right, let's look at the first woman. Pardon me. We have in verse 7, the father's words. Keep my words, says the father to his son. And then keep my commands and live. Proverbs 7, I'm sorry, this is in verse 1. Excuse me, verse 1. In verse 2, keep my commands and live. The father's law is the apple of the son's eye. His words are bound to the son's fingers. The father's commands are the tablet on the son's heart. The father's words are the son's sister. The father's words are wisdom, the faithful woman. But verse 5 identifies another woman, the immoral woman, the seductress who flatters with her words. And if her words flatter, there's something attractive about her words, especially to young men. This flattering woman offers perverse counsel. She's another counselor who has words that are available to the son. Two counselors are available to the son here. The father's words and the seductress's words. Two women are beckoning him. Proverbs 7 here it presents an illustration of effective parenting. What is Lady Wisdom? She's the voice of a parent. She's a father's wise counsel to his son. You see the father's leadership, his advice, his counsel, the father's fathering steers the child from the seductress. Parenting is God's appointed means of protecting your kids from the world. Dad, sit up and take notice. It is your wisdom that should present itself to your son as an attractive woman. And your wisdom must be more attractive than the flattery of a seductress. Now the chapter goes on in some detail with the wise words of a father. Proverbs 7 is a model of good parenting. Look further at the interaction between father and son, picking up at verse 6. I'm sorry, I'd begun at verse 1 through 6 here. Now at verse 6. At the window of my house I looked through my lattice and saw among the simple I perceived among the youth a young man devoid of understanding, passing along the street near her corner. He took the path to her house. In the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark of night, and there a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. She was loud and rebellious. Her feet would not stay at home. At times she was outside, at times in the open square, lurking at every corner. She caught him and kissed him. With an impudent face, she said to him, I have peace offerings with me. Today I have paid my vows. She's a church girl. So I came out to meet you diligently to seek your face. And I have found you. I have spread my bed with tapestry, colored coverings of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on the appointed day with her enticing speech. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. Immediately, he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver as a bird hastens to the snare. He did not know it would cost his life. Now, therefore, listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. Some points to notice here. First, notice that the Son is not being sheltered from the world. The Father's not clapping his hand over his Son's eyes, saying, Son, don't look, don't see this. He's calling his Son over the window, saying, hey, Son, take a look at this. Telling his Son to look straight out into the world. And notice that the world that the Son's being exposed to is not an edited version. It's the real world as the world actually presents itself. It's not PG rating. It's not a sanitized version. It's not a pre-digested version of the world by the parent in order to make it more palatable to the child. And notice that the Son is not being exposed to the world, and this is very important. He's not being exposed to the world all by himself. The Father is there with him. Here's what the Father, in exposing his Son to the world, is not doing this. He's not saying, okay, Son, go and study the seductress on your own. Go into the world, and if you encounter a seductress, I hope that goes well. The Son's exposure to the world is part of an ongoing conference between Father and Son. The Son is not flying solo in this interaction. So notice then, as you think about the world and its flatteries, its seductions, its seductive corruptions, the Son is not facing them alone, but the Son is facing them with Dad. I had a friend of mine. I thought this was a great moment in parenting. He talks about his son. When his son was coming of age, there was a friend group was going out to a movie, and the movie was, well, it had some improprieties in it and so what my friend did is he said, he said this, I don't think you should go with your friends. You want to go to the movie, son? Yeah, he wanted to go to the movie. How about this? You and I, that same night, you're not going to go with your friends. You're going to go with me. Taking care to drive to the next town so that they wouldn't be seen with the friend group that was going there. And so then there was a scene that you might expect that presented itself on the screen, and my friend was, so what would you do if you were watching this scene right now with Sally sitting by you? What would you do if you were watching this scene right now and the son just squirmed? That was a great moment of parenting, I think. And that's kind of a modern day picture, I think, of what Solomon's doing in Proverbs chapter 7. And I want to talk about then sending your kids into the world, and we need to talk a little bit about the world and some practicalities for this. But that's the paradigm. The paradigm passage, I think, is Proverbs chapter 7. And because I am who I am, history guy, I've got some slides up here that I want to talk you through and to think about popular culture here. So, and I'm going to do this from a historical perspective, the goal being to give you some categories as you think through and then have conversations with your kid. What I can't do, and you know that I can't do this, I can't talk you through the next thing that's going to present itself to you as a parent. I don't know what it is. You don't know what it is. Okay? Which is why I'm going to go back to history, and sometimes the retrospect and hindsight can give us some cleaner categories to bring to bear on whatever new and latest thing is going to come up. I'm just a horrible source for the new and latest thing. I'm not going to give you the new and latest thing, but I think that the past can sometimes help us with the new and latest thing. So here we are. I'm going to talk about consumerism, mass market, and then consumerism meeting the mass market. And we're going to go back in time here to help you think about and maybe have some talking points to move through with your kids. So starting with consumerism, I want us to go back 150 or so years, so the late 19th century, when we confront the manufacturer. This will be the manufacturer maybe in 1900 who was in a very different place than somebody 100 years prior in 1800, okay, where we have a craft culture. If a cobbler back in 1800, the time of Thomas Jefferson, was making shoes, how would he decide what sizes to make and how many of what sizes to make back then? Like size 7.5. Should I make size 7.5? If so, how many? How would he decide? Some of you probably know. How would he decide? How would you decide? If you were, imagine if you will, you're making shoes and it's 1800. So how do you decide what size to make? What color to make? What's that? The customer. So you have an interaction with the customer? Yeah. It's going to be made to order, right? He's going to make shoes the same way that a chef in a nice restaurant decides how much of one thing to make. The order comes in and then you make it and you fill the order. And so everything he makes, he has a customer already in view, a particular individual customer in view, just like how conventional restaurants still work today. Made to order. But the whole process of manufacturing, it takes advantage of economies of scale. You learned all this in school, and you repeat processes and you repeat stages of the process, so you wind up with a warehouse of shoes. But this creates a problem. Okay, this is a problem what the old manufacturers had to deal with, is I've made stuff, but I don't have the customers. I've made stuff, but I don't have the customers. I have a warehouse full of shoes. Okay? And so that's my problem. I make stuff that hasn't sold yet. Okay, this is a modern phenomenon. And so the solution is to convince people that they need what I've made. Advertising, right? Now, on the other side of it, the worker also has a problem. Imagine the craftsman who goes into his shop with a bunch of materials, and then 6 months later, out comes a car with a functioning internal combustion engine. I would be impressed with that guy. There are some people like that. I know a guy like that, and I'm not that guy. That's really impressive craftsmanship, to take the raw materials and then out comes a car. Okay. Now, let's go back to that guy making shoes. His pride of place in the community, his dignity before the community is going to be attested by the quality of his shoes. Look, she's wearing the shoes that I made. He's wearing the shoes that I made. That's my craftsmanship. Think about the carpenter. You know, the table in that house, at that dining room, that's the table I made. And I made a table over there, and I made the bookcases over there. And that makes you stand up straight in the community and walk tall down the street. But if you are a worker, think about the worker on the Ford assembly line versus the guy who built the car in the shop. He puts the left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. Chassis moves on, and then he puts another left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. Then he puts another left rear quarter panel onto the chassis. That's what the worker does. Okay. What's the worker's effort? How does that relate to the finished product? Can he say, I made that? No, he's become alienated from the product. The product. The stuff that I make no longer displays my talent. So here we have a worker. One guy is taking leather and he's cutting up a bunch of leather, and he gets good at leather cutting. And then these guys cut leather and they start sewing it. And they sew it, and I'll make one stitch and I'll move it down the line. The next guy will sew it. And this guy is going to blow it up and make basketballs. This is in the Spalding assembly line around the turn of the 20th century. Okay. But if there's somebody bouncing a basketball, do you say, look at my craftsmanship, if you're one of these guys? No. Now, so the problem that the worker has, the stuff that I make doesn't display my talent, my value to the community, because I just exert effort. But what if I'm working in a factory? What do I have to show for my effort? You know what I have to show for it. What do I come away with? Why do I stay in the factory? Yeah, I get a paycheck. And so the productivity that I have and the value of my productivity is registered in a paycheck that I turn around and purchase something with. Buying. In the pre-industrial age, my value in the community was reckoned by the quality of my craftsmanship. You can see my benefit to the community in the craftsmanship that exists and is evident in the community. But now, in a post-industrial age, or in industrial age, the value of my productivity is reckoned by what I can convert my labor to, a paycheck, and it registers in buying. This is what consumer culture is, when your identity, your value is transferred not from the dignity of the object made, but in the accumulation of stuff that you can buy and its quality. Okay, that is consumer culture. And of course, that advertising that meets the manufacturer's need also meets the worker's need. I am looking for stuff to put my paycheck to that is going to give me value, and so advertising needs to send a certain message to draw that worker. Okay, so this is how it works. So here we have, this is really great to look at older ads. Meet the girl men want to kiss. Smoothly alluring lips, soft as velvet, with a provocative glow of color like the heart of a rose. No wonder men are fascinated. And so you mass produce a bunch of lipstick, and now you got to cast about for customers. Well, you need to tell them a story. It's going to, and you customers who have wage earner, here's how you can translate your labor into something that makes you valuable. All right, that's the text there. How about this one? Why should you smoke Old Gold cigarettes? What does this have to do with cigarettes? Yeah, you'll be like that, right? All right. All advertising basically follows this pattern. You've got you, here is you, and then there's a vision of the good life. How do you get to the good life? You know how you get to the good life. How do you get to the good life? Yeah, there you go. The product. The product. All right. And so here we go. I love this. Halitosis makes you unpopular. This is Listerine here, just to blow up and see. Well, first of all, look, appreciate the image. So there's three individuals here, 2 women and a man. Which one are you supposed to relate to? Yeah, and it's the cautionary tale relationship, right? This is not a happy story. Halitosis makes you unpopular. Unpopular. It's inexcusable, can be instantly remedied. No matter how charming you may be, how fond of your friends are, you cannot expect them to put up with halitosis, which means unpleasant breath forever. They may be nice to you, but it's an effort. Now, the ad agency, the Listerine was developed in the 19-teens, and they applied it as a balm for all kinds of, it was an ointment, you rub it on your skin, then they realized that it takes care of bad breath, and they thought, how do we pitch this? And so they invented the term halitosis to make it sound medical sounding. Halitosis is a product of an advertising boardroom, not any medical reflection, but it's this condition now. All right. Don't fool yourself that you have never have halitosis, as do so many self-assured people who constantly offend this way. You have it. All right. But let's come back here. All right. So what's the good life? Do you see a narrative of the good life here? And you see a narrative of the bad life. There's the bad life to be avoided, the good life to be cultivated. You don't want to be lonely. You want to be a girl who gets danced with, don't you? That's the good life. That's the good life. Is that the good life? Have you ever seen anyone in a hurry while drinking Corona? It's the only line in the ad. Have you ever seen anyone in a hurry while drinking Corona? That's the fine life, baby. I love this series of Corona ads featuring Snoop Dogg because it actually says the good life. Like, it's the good life. And so it's really easy. It's low-hanging fruit. Is that the good life? The good life is absence of hustle. The good life is absence of industry. Is that the good life? Again, a great series of ads here. I can't say it like Snoop Dogg. Everyone's so busy keeping up. Forget about the Joneses. We all on our telephones is with the texts and the tweets and the beats. What he says, she says, can't even follow the thread. Down in the hole we all go. Me, I like keeping up too with my Corona and my attitude. That's the fine life, baby. All of the text threads and busyness, Now, here's my encouragement to you. Here's my encouragement to you. With advertising, think about Solomon, Proverbs chapter 7. Do you say, hey, let's watch some of this together. Let's get on the web, kids. Remember what the good parent did. it gave them exposure, but then, advertisements are great. And the key question is always, okay, what's the vision for the good life? What's the vision for the good life? It's usually the kind of subtle thing, and yet it's the most necessary thing in almost every ad. What's the vision for the good life? Buy your Corona, drink Corona, and then like Snoop Dogg, you'll be on the, and then ask them the good life. And what is the good life? Teach your kids to read the world. Teach your kids to read the world and to see what the world is up to expose its seductions for what it is. Again, Proverbs chapter 7, the seductress. Look at that seductress. Pay attention. Where does that go? Can you imagine, son? How about a lifestyle would you like to live like this 24/7? Is this the way it is? Going on vacation is a nice thing. Going to the beach is a nice thing. But, anyway. Teach your kids to read the narrative. Talk with them about these things. Listen to music with them. If they like music, then listen to music with them. Talk about it. Why do you like that? What's intriguing about that? In Proverbs chapter 7, there were some intriguing things about that. That seductress, she paid her vows. Excuse me. And with flattering words, she seduced him. Talk to your kids about these things. Make this sort of routine. You can't get away from this stuff. Brenda and I were driving here, so many billboards. You have no shortage of exposure. All right. So that's what consumerism is, and just some encouragement to you in ways of thinking about conversations that are worth having with your kids, and hopefully that little simple review of what consumer culture is and where it comes from is a good way of thinking about it. Consumer culture really is a culture where people's value and identity is reckoned and determined by what they purchase. That's what consumer culture is. It differentiates a consumer culture from other forms of culture. And it arises in modernity in a unique way. Well, these messages rely on some technological developments too. So we go back to the 1800s. American progress. Of course, we have the sunrise on the right side, and of course, it's odd that this reads right to left rather than left to right. But the reason why it does, of course, is expansion is westward. Definitely, you're all in California here, you can appreciate that. Expansion's always westward. And you've got the city over on the right, which is bright and shining. And civilization, of course, the Native Americans are always receding into the dark on the lower left. And you see the miners with their pickaxes and the farmers up there with his stagecoach, the guys hunting buffalo up above them. And to the right, you've got the railroad coming. And what does she have in her hand? She's got a book and a telegraph wire. Transportation and communication. That's American progress. Transportation and communication. Advertising becomes really interesting here. Before we got wireless, you can appreciate pre-wireless versus wireless here when you see what telegraph wires used to look like. But the telegraph was pretty amazing. It allowed communication to travel for the first time in human history. Finally, for it to go faster than either a horse could run or for wind could push a sail. Okay, George Washington got messages the same speed as Julius Caesar got messages, as fast as a horse could run or as fast as wind could push a sail, until we developed the telegraph. The telegraph was pretty amazing. We can also move people and things and goods. 1850, here we are. This is railroads. 1870 up above. Oh, finally, we've got it out to California, and by 1890, Los Angeles is in the picture, so now you can see where you, when you come onto the grid here, even up in Idaho, we're on the grid by 1890. So we've got communication transportation networks. And these communication and transportation networks facilitate some interesting developments, which is the ability for the first time to have people in New York and Los Angeles reading the same material, and they can read the same material at pretty close to almost the same time through telegraph wires and then newspaper articles. It's amazing that people so distant from each other can kind of read the same thing and experience the same thing. Magazine publishers can ship their magazines across the way. Now, these numbers here signify something that was really interesting that developed with magazines and also newspapers, printed material in the 19th century. It used to be with the old newspapers, the newspapermen would make their money by selling newspapers. So the readers were their customers. And so they would sell newspapers. But then an interesting thing happened in the 1890s. We had two rival newspapermen, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, who went toe-to-toe trying to get more customers in New York for their New York newspapers. And so Hearst and Pulitzer went at it, and they both discovered about the same time a shift in their economic model. They realized that the more people who read their newspapers, the more valuable their advertising space was on their newspapers. So, for example, if I put an ad, and that ad goes in a magazine that circulates to 100 people, and then the same ad that goes into a magazine that circulates to 100,000 people, which would I rather put my ad in? And now Hearst and Pulitzer, and then others were soon to follow, realized that they would make more money from advertisers rather than from subscribers and paper buyers. And so what happened to the price of the paper? The more I sell, the more money I make. So the price goes down and down and down till the papers went down to 1 cent. And magazines went from subscriptions from $1 down to 15 cents to get 12 issues of a magazine, because you could sell more that way. And the price went down and down and down, so you could print more and more, get them before more eyes. And through this technology and business modeling, we wind up with tons of printed material in just the span of 2 generations. Circulation, this is just magazines. Newspapers were even more. This creates an environment where a bunch of people are reading and seeing the same thing. The vision for the good life is being circulated to a lot more people and penetrating the ranks of society much more deeply than it had ever before, and reaches across space. So let's talk about consumerism then meeting the mass market. Let's take one of these magazines, the Ladies' Home Journal. Ladies' Home Journal in 1897 publishes a series of the American woman. This is the ideal American woman. Ladies' Home Journal, one of the most highly respected magazines. If you were a proper woman, you had this on your nightstand or on your coffee table. Ladies' Home Journal. And here we have the woman in religion. We have 4 generations represented, a multi-generational vision here. We've got the mom, there's grandma, great-grandma, and the daughter kind of growing into this. Another in the same series, the woman in the home. She's cultivating herself, She's in mixed company. There's what the men and women are doing. This is feminine propriety here in the Ladies' Home Journal. But something happened really fascinating is one of the great illustrators of the day, a guy named Charles Dana Gibson, got famous for his illustrations. And he was so famous, he made the cover of Ladies' Home Journal in 1903. Mr. Gibson's American Girl. Charles Dana Gibson got famous for these drawings of a particular vision of femininity. Some of you, if you're a fan of Anne of Green Gables, might remember seeing there's a scene where Anne is primping to go somewhere and her friend Diana said, "Anne, you look just like a Gibson girl." Now you see what the Gibson girl is. The Gibson girl, a certain notion of femininity. Charles Dana Gibson became a celebrity as an illustrator. Does a Gibson girl really exist? No, she's the product of Charles Dana Gibson's pen. And so everyone wants to put their hair like this. These Gibson girls, a certain ideal type here. And the Gibson girl is often portrayed in relationship to other things. Like, do you want to be the lady on the right, the stuffy guy on the left? You know, you can't have the Gibson girl. She just rises above it. You've got two women, the angry men. Anyway, you see the Gibson girl. Do you see what these Gibson girls are poking at? With their magnifying glass and prodding, it's a guy. Now, this is great stuff. This created a sensation, but I want to show you what happened out here in Los Angeles then. So the Los Angeles Herald in 1905 puts this question out there: has Los Angeles a Gibson girl? Or is there a Gibson girl in Los Angeles? Now, I want you to realize what happened. The fact that this question is being asked is fascinating. Charles Dana Gibson never came out to California. But they're asking, do the girls that we interact with here in California measure up to the Gibson girl? What we're starting to see here is young men and young women changing how they conceive of feminine beauty and attractiveness. A generation earlier, so let's talk about shallow guys. You have shallow guys for, through all generations, right? And they might have worldly attachments to girls and visions for girls. Or they can be dignified, they can be shallow, but how are guys going to develop their notion of what a pretty girl is? It's by the guys gathering, talking about the girls in their experience, in their lived experience in their town. Now what we have is a community drawing their notions of what makes a pretty girl from a completely different source. And it's nationalized and it penetrates the ranks of society. Rather than face-to-face human interactions drawing your sense of value, whether it's petty or dignified. A lot of this is petty, I'll grant you. But I want you to see that the motor is mediated now and presented like this. That's where the notion is coming from. Has Los Angeles a Gibson girl? How bizarre is that question? Okay. Well, you know what this leads us, the American Girl face. So this leads to where we were, in the 1990s, where we have images then that are put forward as that, and people in their experience assess themselves based on whether or not they align with or depart from a constructed image, a curated image that's in the media, that's been happening now for over 100 years. Okay. and it continues into the 1990s. I would encourage you to talk to your kids about this, and sometimes just talking about the mechanisms and the strangeness of it hopefully should be striking to them. Like, how did that work? Why are we even asking this question? How did that happen? And have these conversations with your kids. So as you expose your kids to the world, again, be the parent in Proverbs 7 and ask questions when you're watching the game on TV and Snoop Dogg's there on the Corona ad, saying, that's an interesting one. Why did that happen? Where did this advertisement come? Just start asking questions and train your kids to interrogate and identify the vision of the good life, where the vision of the good life comes from, how it aligns with a healthier vision for the good life. There's not a lot here. It's kind of shallow. It's more than kind of shallow. But we oftentimes don't train up our kids to just interrogate it. Just interrogate it. And parents should begin interrogating that with them. Now, and we know how this happens also with people. That, cities, again, to be lonely in a crowd was a new phenomenon born of the modern world when you have concentrated populations and a weird experience that people have that they didn't have in pre-industrial times, which is you would go down a street and you would experience people you never saw before, and then the next day you'd go down the same street and again you'd experience people you never saw before. And then the day after that you'd go down the street and experience people you'd never seen before. In a big bustling city, as you drive by the cars on the streets today, it's kind of like that, where it's a familiar street and yet you're in a crowd that's undifferentiated. It's a mass of people. Okay. It used to be that you would see somebody, and maybe if it's the first time, that's a stranger. And if they're not a stranger, it's someone you know. And the strangers, like the very notion of stranger is kind of interesting. It takes a norm of people you're acquainted with, and the stranger sticks out. What about when the strangers are normal? It's a weird phenomenon that develops, and it creates a condition of loneliness in a crowd. Loneliness in a crowd, where you can be in the midst of people and yet alone, right? It's a distinctively modern phenomenon. And we've developed ways of coping with this, where we start vicariously participating in individuals so that I will start to see myself and my experience through a mediated image. And so the more I am like this image, then his experiences can be my experiences. It creates a thirst for vicarious participation. This is Douglas Fairbanks and Clara Bow, two very famous people, and we wind up with people asking, do they have it? Whatever it is that sort of compels that vicarious participation that solves people's anxieties about being lonely in a crowd. Oh, if I'm like this person, or perhaps my basis for interacting with you can be a conversation about what we read together in the media. Okay. So it solves that loneliness in a crowd. We wind up with these funny things that develop in the 1920s. Here's Charles Lindbergh. Let's see. He has a baby. He's the guy who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a plane, and everyone was fascinated by Charles Lindbergh. And so when he has a baby, people send him congratulation cards, thousands of them, because at this time we're just trying to navigate that strange relationship. Is it personal or is it impersonal? Is it personal or is it impersonal? And that distinction gets collapsed with these people. And so what would possess people to write a note of congratulations to Charles Lindbergh when he has a baby? Okay. And then when Rudolph Valentino dies, I want you to notice that this is a Seattle paper. way across the country from where Valentino was, the sheik, he's famous for a role, the sheik, nearly 100 herd is 50,000, mostly girls, fight to view him when he was lying in state because they had a relationship with Rudolph Valentino. Okay. Loneliness in a crowd creates an environment where a celebrity starts to make sense. It's a distinctly modern phenomenon, a post-industrial phenomenon, a product of the cities, very different than a well-known person that we've had throughout all the ages. It's a mediated and curated vision of somebody that you're exposed to through a mediated experience. And it creates some really interesting and peculiar behaviors. All right. One girl wanted to make sure that she was displaying the appropriate response, and so she brought onions with her to Valentino's memorial so that she would be seen tearing up. Because that's the right socially acceptable response to Valentino, because you care. Now, this is a weird behavior, isn't it? And yet, here we are. Here we are. Again, I would encourage you to talk to your kids about this. How did that happen? Why does that happen? Why do you care? How did you come to care? Do your friends care? Are you talking to your friends about this? And what's the vision for the good life that is projected here? I go into the history of it partly because that's who I am, but also partly because I'm trying to suggest some categories and some approaches. Not that you need to bring up Lindbergh and Valentino, but it's my way of trying to communicate this with an X-ray that kind of analyzes this, that I think you need to train your kids to do and to think about. It's part of taming the seduction of that seductress, and it's important for your kids. And then it gets really interesting as we move more recent, back when I was growing up, this is not recent at all, where music used to be something that if you were listening to music, it was inherently a community activity. But then we can make our music portable with headphones. And so it becomes possible for each of us in this room to be listening to different music. That was a really interesting development that arose in the late 70s and early 80s. And then when we all get personal computers and we can print stuff, we can start desktop publishing in the 90s. Really interesting thing develops where we can not only consume things individually, but we can produce things individually. And then layered on top of that is the iPhone. The iPhone, which, and through social media, people can become their own curators of their own image and their own consumers and curate the content that they themselves consume. And so you can build up your own vision of the good life. Now you're in the role of what Listerine was doing, but you're your own Listerine. You can call if you're a male, you can call yourself a female. You can, just like if the Listerine people can do it, I can do it too, about myself. And that's the vision of the good life. That's a historical reflection that brings us to some of the issues that your kids confront. The takeaway here is, I hope that you will just develop a habit and a practice of raising questions around them, with them. Isn't that interesting? Watch what they watch, see what they see, experience what they experience along with them, rather than having them fly solo. Again, what did the father in Proverbs chapter 7 doesn't say, there's some interesting things out there in the world. Hope it works out well for you, son. No, he says, let's come over to the window together and let's talk about this. That's what's happening in Proverbs chapter 7. This should become a habit and a routine in your homes, especially with your older kids. So, again, as I walk through some of these, again, advertising music, the whole panoply. And I would really encourage you to keep them away from the cell phones as long as you can. We can talk more about that if you like. But with that, I think we'll call our time up here. Expose your kids to the world in order to send them into the world to change the world. Thanks.
Once again, we have two microphones and one over there too. So let's take a few minutes. If you have some questions, come on.
Hello, Arnold here. I have a question when you talked about the quality of products 200-300 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and people found value and identity in the quality. Do you think that 200-300 years ago, people kind of fell into the extreme of praising and valuing form and style over function and utility? For example, sometimes I see these people on online blogs or social media putting pictures of some old European classic drainage pipes of buildings that are draining the rainwater is coming down, and they're very colorful, super high quality, and they look like a work of art. And they just juxtapose that with the modern, thin, cheap, the drainage pipes that don't have, any form to it, any style. And they are, oh, look how, quality and, things have dropped, but they kind of neglect to show that back then it cost a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of craftsmanship to design that pipe and produce it. And they had it in super low quantities, So you had a city that 10% of the city looked like, aristocracy, classic museum, and then 90% of the city looked like a gutter, with ghettos and people starving a lot of that, So, but with the modern, cheap, kind of formless, that nowadays they are more focusing on functionality and utility, usage of things. So it has become affordable for everyone, and every building has it. What do you think about that? That in old times they, focused more and went to the extremes of, focusing on the form of things and not function of things. So.
Yeah. First of all, I'm not sure that I would accept the premise that they focused on form earlier and now we're without form. I think there's a lot of attention that's given to form today. If I just look at a McDonald's building and that architecture, there's a lot of attention to it's an architectural billboard saying get your Big Macs here. I should probably say In-N-Out Burger if I'm down here, right? So that's a certain point to your direct point, but insofar as it concerns parents and parenting, what I went into here is to help expose the medium that our messaging about the good life plays out on today, and to come to understand that so we can actually read and understand the messaging about the good life today. And we need to be able to interrogate it, just as a faithful parent 150 years ago would have to navigate the culture and the situation that a parent was facing 150 years ago. I'm not suggesting that the good old days were, there were good old days and we're the bad new days. These are the days that we're in, and just understand the the motors that drive the days that we're in, and be sure that your kids understand the times and can navigate the times. So hopefully that gets, I think there's probably more to your question, but hopefully that at least puts the ball in play. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I liked it. I personally don't really like using social media, and I don't particularly want my kids to do it because I think it is the modern version of that kind of like presenting the good life in order to
Mm-hmm.
live their good life, but it's not actual good living. It's all made up, right? But I don't want to necessarily be the like parent that just goes and says, "You can't do this because I said so." Um, but I also want to influence my kids to not
Right.
be interested in that. I don't know. I kind of wanted to ask, like, what is your approach to that? Would you be the type of parent who would just say, "Don't do it because I said," or how would you go about getting them to not want to be on social media because that is a big thing that almost everybody wants to be on now?
Right. That's a great question. First of all, I think, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we get to little kids, but little kids are born into a totalitarian police state, which is your home, and they don't eat or sleep or go anywhere without your direction and approval, and of course, and that's going to include no social media, right? And I think that the sentiment that you are expressing is, my inclination would be delay social media till, 16, 18, even better. But when I say delay social media, it's, I want to clarify here. I don't want my kids to grow up unaware of a world where social media is a thing. Okay, so remember, one of the key things about the way social media works today is that it's a context outside of the Proverbs 7 type context where you've got father and son together. The whole genius of social media is the kids curating it. Who is curating the scene in Proverbs 7? And I think to the point, if your kid's on Instagram at age 13, well, he shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be on Instagram at age 13 because you have just simply undermined what, fend for yourself, oh kid. And yet your 13-year-old, you should be talking about a world in which social media exists. So when you say exposure, think about the hows and the wherefores, giving them a social media account. No. But talking to them about social media, maybe sitting down and saying, "Hey, let's see what your friends are doing now," and show them so that it's going to be this kind of normal thing rather than some strange exotic, that which cannot be touched or something like that. And so it becomes fetishized in a weird way. So, and the attitude about social media and I would say a lot of other things, it's kind of like an automobile. You don't tell your kids no, you tell your kids not yet. Okay. So will your 5-year-old be driving? Yes. As a 5-year-old? And so then think about the age, and I would delay the age dramatically. Another thing that I would encourage you to do, one of the challenges with social media, is because it's social, I think a community of parents is really needed to keep kids out of social media rather than the one-off family who's in isolation. I think as a church, that would be a great conversation for you all to have as your kids or friends together saying, "Hey, together we are all not going to have our kids with iPhones until they're like out of high school or something." I don't know, whatever the age might be, but something like that. So that's my attitude. Think back to Proverbs chapter 7. And social media is designed so that it's happening without the father in the room. Yep.
Thank you for your talk. I like this idea of the father coming along, right, and exposing the world
Mm-hmm.
in that way, to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
My question is, what about those things that are so graphic, so sinful, we don't even want to view them at all, in particular pornography? Like, how can you prepare your child for a world that is pornographic? Because it's going to look different, so how would that?
Right. And that's a very good question. There's certain images that are just inherently designed to seduce, and I would say that you should definitely talk to your kids about pornography, and they should hear about it probably first from you, then from other sources. But you don't. I think there is something different between text and image, and I would certainly withhold, like, these are images that you should just stay away from altogether. I stay away from them too. And it's kind of like fathers staying away from larceny, I'm staying away from these pornographic stuff. They exist, and you're old enough, here's what it depicts, and we don't do that. But here's the world, and here's how it's happening, here's how we avoid it, that sort of. So it should be a conversation. But I would agree with you. You don't do that by looking at it. Again, it's similar to. It is similar to larceny or theft. You talk about it happening. You don't have to participate in it. And I would say pornography falls into that category. Should be talked about in order to avoid rather than participating in it. But I think a picture of Taylor Swift is fine.
Yeah, Chris, my question's about consumerism, and you showed us the way that consumerism works with advertising.
Mm-hmm.
What sinful behaviors do you think consumerism leads towards? Right, we know that in Proverbs 7, the young man is being led towards adultery. What about what does consumerism lead to that's so sinful? And then the second point, or my second question is, advertisement makes whatever it's selling seem really, really good.
Right.
And it's one thing
because it paints a vision for the good life.
Right.
Yep.
So it's one thing to be like, hey, this good life thing is happening. We know that that's not the vision of the good life, so don't get fooled,
Right.
And can that kind of lead to a certain sort of cynicism? So how is it that we can fight that the vision that advertisers have? So.
Yeah, good. I'll start with the second question first, and I appreciate this. I love Q&A because it also helps me to qualify and to try to nuance. I mean, the pornography question I think was a good one. Yeah, don't give your kids pornography. That's not what I was talking about. But I would say, like the Snoop Dogg commercial, it just so happens that I have consumed Corona beer. I'll admit that, okay? But that's the conversation you want to have. When, in what context? Sitting on a beach, sometimes your family probably sits on a beach, and that's kind of nice. So what place does that have in the good life? Rather than, and these are blessings from God, and so leisure, sunshine, sitting on a beach, I think that's a rich conversation. And they're all going to be, advertisements are going to oftentimes be good, bad mixes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be attractive. So it's trafficking in something that probably can be redeemed in some context, but usually they are miscontextualized, and so you can recontextualize it within the conversation. So that would be the practical outcome, and I appreciate the question because it's not like, oh, I'm against Corona and Snoop Dogg is stupid. That's not the message, and that's not going to be a satisfying conversation with your kids either, right? But just have the conversation and bring the scriptures to bear upon it. With consumer culture, I do think that, there's nothing inherently wrong with advertising, and there's nothing inherently wrong with purchasing things, and there's nothing inherently with all of that. I do think that there are tendencies within consumer culture that are obvious to us, tendencies that would boil down to a failure to love God and love neighbor. Love God for the gift that he's given and show gratitude for him. It fosters an ingratitude for the gifts that he has given, and a failure to love neighbor in that it orients you toward consumption rather than production. I want to build to bless my neighbor rather than feed my anxiety, and it reinforces, it amplifies my anxiety about my status, and it plays into my anxiety about my status, and I need to address that anxiety rather than bless my neighbor with my fruitfulness. So, and I think those are very common temptations that kind of are move with the tide of consumerism. There's probably others too, greed and things like that are worth talking about with your kids. So, good questions.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm going to try to say this more succinctly, but it has a little bit of a preamble. So I'm thinking about what you said about John 3:16, that being sort of like a parenting verse, and sending your kids out into the world. And then I think about Jesus Christ, and he was sent out and got into a really big fight with the world, and he was crucified, but he won.
Yep.
And think about maybe myself and my kids, and sending my son out, to tear off the biggest piece of the world that he can get, that he thinks that to fight a fight that he thinks he can win. And then I think, like, what if I have a more modest ambition for my son than that? Maybe to enjoy the family and the wife that he's been given, to enjoy his hobbies, to serve other people locally in a more modest state, and to say, I'm aiming a lot lower than, obviously we can't aim for our kids to be like Christ exactly, but maybe having a more modest goal than, go be the flaming arrow and hit the biggest target, get in those fights, change the world as much as you possibly can. Just be a workaholic, be a workhorse for the kingdom. Like, is it kind of a sin or not using your talents very well to ask for less than go, fight, build?
I think there's that's a good question. I think the answer really would come to a theology of vocation, of calling. What are your kids called to? I think that the posture that I was laying out should be sort of the attitude that governs it all, but then how does that manifest? It's going to manifest, it manifests differently for each of our kids. We've raised 5 kids, and all 5 of them have different callings. They're in our 5 kids are in 3 different cities. There's a difference right there, and they're married to different spouses, and so there's a difference. And so for one person, it might look, they would pursue, a certain craft that might be a very locally, deeply rich within the community, like you say. And maybe there's a local farmer's market and their craft is there, but it starts to penetrate and change and bless a lot of people through face-to-face relationships, and so it changes people. I think that's wonderful. It doesn't have to be a global reach. I do think that people doing that will have a global reach over time and as it's aggregated among the body of Christ. So a good theology of vocation, but I won't pull back on the posture of ambition, a godly ambition. You've got to send your kids into the world to redeem the world for Christ, and don't let up on the gas pedal on that a bit. And I think that's a Christian's calling. That's right. And Andrew, you can pull the plug whenever you're ready. Mhm.
I talk a lot and share a lot. Everyone here knows that. And one of the things that was sticky was how you deal with gray areas when you're talking about the world, because we all have a certain amount of Christian liberty where we can
Mhm.
disagree about where we draw the lines for ourselves. And the Bible tells us, that we should never go against our conscience, but we can't have our kids have the same conscience as us. So how do you have those conversations where you even believe your child loves the Lord, loves His Word,
Mhm.
and you and your child draw lines in different places for what's acceptable or not? Does that make sense? Like
Um,
the harder discussions about what you would watch if you watched a movie, or what you would listen to, or what kind of language is acceptable and not acceptable. The places where even within this community you might all disagree. Did you have any experiences with your kids?
yeah. Well, this might be what you're getting at. First of all, when they're under age 5 or 6, there's no gray area. It's just the law that you've handed down, and that's all they know, and that's where that's where it is. There is no gray area. And bedtime is at 8 o'clock, and that's just bedtime, and so there it is. And you're going to bed at 8 o'clock. When I talk about the totalitarian police state, of course, as kids get older, then the restrictions come off. One of the temptations that older parents of older kids often have is they don't like some of the things that their growing kids are doing as they get older, and so they want to overreact by clamping down and adding restrictions, when the pattern of parenting should be they start with, like, what's an infant? Goodness, you control everything. And as they grow older, you're pulling restrictions away. That's the pattern. And in our family, and I think in a lot of families, a lot of these gray areas would manifest in what you call gray areas. Kids, they reach the early teenage years, and even before then, they will notice that we do things in our house that are different than some of their friends' houses. My friend can do this, but I can't do that. And it often manifests that way. That's my experience. And so then you have to talk through that, and you'll probably say something like, and I would encourage you to think this way: well, in a few years that'll be your decision, but here's our decision now, and we're going to talk through we're going to talk through why. And here's why you don't need to dismiss your friend, but here's why we do it this way in our household. And sometime it's going to be your house, so you're going to have to make these decisions yourself. In fact, and you should tell this to your kids, you're going to be confronting social and cultural issues that I can't anticipate, right? Of course you you are, right? Pardon my cough. But so I would just talk through. You've got your lines and your restrictions. There's certain things that you leave open to them, certain things that you don't leave open to them, and you talk about those. And as they see that there are families that function differently, lean into that. Let's have a conversation about it. And it's an opportunity to teach and explain. I trust you have good reasons, so offer them. You didn't, again, the presumption is that you've got reasons for your standards, so impart them. That's the law of the mother. That's your job. And have those conversations and relish them.